educators, we all want our students engaged in authentic, rigorous assignments that allow them to grapple with complex content in meaningful, productive ways. We want to teach them to be excellent communicators and informed citizens. We want our assignments to prepare them for college and careers. It's a small ask, right? It's no wonder so many of us start the year looking down a lesson pipeline 180 days long and wonder where to even begin. How can we cover it all? Should we cover it all? Where should we even start? We should start with what the research shows. Task predicts performance. That's right, everything we want for our students, content understanding, strong reading and writing skills, the ability to communicate competently, it all starts with a strong task. Strong task, strong results in student work. Weak task, weaker work. So how do we write strong tasks? Well, we start with a focus cluster of standards. A focus cluster is the trio of Kentucky academic standards that will inform the primary focus of your task and instruction. In ELA, using the Kentucky academic standards for reading and writing, your focus cluster of standards should include 2 reading standards and 1 composition standard. Each standard in the focus cluster should leverage the other standards in the cluster to create opportunities for rigorous thinking work in your task. Let's break down how this works. The first reading standard in a focus cluster, the what, addresses the disciplinary content your students should be thinking about during the task. For example, what will they be grappling with? Theme, R2, language, R4, perspective or purpose, R6? The second reading standard in a focus cluster, the how, addresses how students are thinking about that content. For example, are they thinking about the theme, R2, the what, through the lens of the language, R4, the how? Or are they looking at development, R3, the what, through the lens of the structure, R5, the how? The third standard in the cluster, the composition standard, articulates how students will communicate their thinking. What is the mode and structure of their writing? What type of information and evidence will be included? Let's look at how this works. Consider the following 5th grade ELA reading standard, RL.5.2. Analyze how the theme is reflected in the text, including but not limited to poems, stories, and dramas, and cite relevant implicit and explicit evidence to support thinking. A task based on this standard might be: read and analyze how the theme is reflected in the text. Cite relevant implicit and explicit evidence to support your thinking. While the standard on its own could lend itself to a rigorous task, it doesn't give the teacher or students a lot of guidance. How should they analyze a theme? Through what lens? Students will need support identifying and analyzing how the theme is reflected in the text, but there are multiple avenues by which to offer support. Should you spend your time talking about the relationship between figurative language and theme? What about perspective and purpose, development or structure? And how will students know what evidence is relevant in a task as broad as this one? A single assignment couldn't and shouldn't cover all these options, but this standard left alone in a prompt leaves those options on the table, and teachers and students alike will struggle with where to focus their attention. Developing a focus cluster can raise the level of rigor in the thinking the students will need to do to respond to the task by offering important insight on how students should respond to the task. Let's look at how this works. We begin with that first reading standard, which describes the disciplinary content of the task, the what. RL.5.2. Analyze how the theme is reflected in the text, including but not limited to poems, stories, and dramas, and cite relevant implicit and explicit evidence to support thinking. Next, we add a second reading standard, the how. For this task, we decide to use RL.5.9. Compare and contrast stories in the same genre on their approaches to similar themes and topics. We've chosen this reading standard to complement the first reading standard because now students have a specific lens through which to analyze theme. They will need to look at how a particular theme is addressed across 2 or more texts, noting similarities and differences. This is a critical, enduring skill, not only in ELA, where important themes often appear and make statements across a variety of texts, but also in life. How is a topic addressed across sources? How do we make sense of how a topic is portrayed in different sources? Together, these two reading standards support students in learning to summarize and synthesize in order to draw important conclusions on a specific topic, or in this case, a specific theme. With our two reading standards in mind, we add the composition standards so that teachers and students know how students' thinking will be communicated. See point 5.2. Compose informative and/or explanatory texts using writing and digital resources to examine a topic and convey ideas and information clearly. In this case, we are not interested in students making an argument in favor of a specific interpretation of a theme, or in one text better conveying a theme than another. Rather, we want students to inform a rational reader on how a theme is constructed across more than one text. And, together with the first and second reading standards, students now have some guidance in what kind of evidence they will need to include to support their conclusions. Using the new focus cluster, RL 5.2 plus RL 5.9 plus C.5.2, we can write the following task. After reading Masks and The Rose That Grew from Concrete, write a literary analysis in which you compare and contrast how the author of each poem reflects on the topic of identity. Support your response with evidence from the text. In this task, students will certainly have to analyze the theme of the text, but they will do so in the context of important disciplinary thinking, how the same theme can be addressed differently depending on the author. The task also requires them to use the critical writing skill, using specific textual details related to the topic in writing. When placed side by side, you can see the difference in the level of rigor between the tasks. The first task addresses one disciplinary skill, analyzing theme. The revised task that uses a focus cluster addresses 3 disciplinary skills in tandem, and each standard raises the rigor of the other standard. And while you may address other academic standards over the course of the assignment, these focus standards become the central goals of your assignment. Selecting focus standards in a cluster allows you to decide where you're going to expend your instructional energy, and, more importantly, which standards you're going to pay close attention to when formatively tracking student progress from the beginning to the end of the assignment. The standards cluster also helps you think about going deep on standards rather than going wide. Selecting a cluster of focus standards means that you are selecting the specific set of high-leverage standards you want your students to use with confidence by the end of your assignment. Let's take some time now to become familiar with the thinking work being articulated in the Kentucky Academic Standards for Reading and Writing. Before continuing, use your module guide to engage in some short activities that will support you in designing strong tasks using the Kentucky Academic Standards for Reading and Writing. The Focus Standards Cluster uses a trio of Kentucky academic standards for reading and writing to raise the rigor of your task. In order to make sure your focus cluster is what's driving your task, you should see the language from the focus cluster standards in the prompt itself. After all, the prompt is what drives your instruction and your students' writing, and the focus cluster is what should be driving your prompt. The easiest way to check for evidence of your focus standards cluster in your task is by color coding. Let's look at an 8th grade ELA example to see how this works. Here is the task. After reading an excerpt from Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, write a rhetorical analysis in which you discuss Carson's purpose for writing and evaluate her use of figurative and technical language to respond to conflicting viewpoints and convey her perspective. Support your discussion with evidence from the text. The focus standards for this task are To help us see how each standard is represented in the prompt, let's give each standard a color. Now, let's look for evidence of each standard in the prompt itself. We should be able to see exact or paraphrased language directly from the standard embedded in the prompt. Let's start with the first reading standard, RI.8.6. The disciplinary content this standard supports is determining purpose and perspective, and how an author acknowledges and responds to conflicting points of view. We see evidence of this standard in the prompt when it calls on students to discuss Carson's purpose for writing and examine how she responds to conflicting viewpoints and conveys her perspective. Next, let's look at RI.8.4, which is about how language use can impact meaning in a text. In this case, the prompt instructs students to consider how Carson uses figurative and technical language to respond to conflicting viewpoints and convey her perspective. We will also highlight convey because convey alludes to the standard's demand to consider the impact the figurative and technical language has in conveying meaning, or in this case, perspective. Finally, let's look for evidence of the composition standard, C.8.1. In this case, the prompt asks students to write a rhetorical analysis, which is an argumentative text. They will also need to evaluate Carson's choices around language use, which is an argumentative move. Additionally, students are asked to support their discussion with evidence from the text. Color coding in this way shows us that the focus standard cluster is driving the task because the language of the standards is embedded in the prompt itself. Furthermore, we can see the way in which each standard in the focus cluster is working in tandem with the other standards in the focus cluster to make the task rigorous, explicitly standards-driven, and authentic to the discipline. Let's look at one more example. This is an 11th to 12th grade ELA task. The task reads, after reading the yellow wallpaper, write a literary analysis in which you explain how the author's choice to include gaps between diary entries impacts character development. Support your discussion with evidence from the text. The standards driving this task are Once again, let's give each standard a color. Now, let's code the prompt. We will begin with the first reading standard. RL.11-12.3 is the development standard, and the prompt references this standard by asking students to write about character development in the text. The second reading standard asks students to think about how an author makes choices about structure in a text to impact meaning. We see this standard in the prompt when students are asked to consider the impact of the author's decision to include gaps between diary entries. Finally, let's look for the composition standard. In this case, students are asked to write a literary analysis, which is a kind of informational or explanatory text. And they are asked to support their discussion with evidence from the text, which gets at the standard's demand that students convey their ideas clearly and accurately through the effective selection, organization, and analysis of content. Once again, highlighting the prompt in this way allows you to ensure not only that your task is explicitly standards-driven, after all, the language of the standards is literally in the prompt itself, but also that the standards are working together to support and leverage each other. As you unpack the Kentucky Academic Standards for Reading and Writing for yourself and your students, you're going to want to embed the language of the standards in your prompts and color code to make sure that you see evidence of those standards in the prompt itself. Doing so allows you to make informed decisions about what to teach and not teach in support of a given assignment. Focus clusters also help your students. Just as the focus cluster helps you to narrow down the thinking you expect from your students, it also guides your students in doing that thinking. If they can recognize the focus cluster and how the standards work together, they should be empowered to better approach the work required in the assignment. Remember, the first reading standard articulates what it is your students are thinking about. The second reading standard articulates how your students are doing that thinking. And the composition standard lets the students know how to communicate that thinking. Color coding should become a seminal process not only when you are writing your own prompts, but also when you distribute them to your students. Color code when you're writing as a way to check that your task is standards-driven and standards-aligned. Have your students color code after you distribute the tasks so that they can recognize the standards they'll be working on and know explicitly what is being asked of them. Return now to your module guide so that you can gain practice using the Kentucky Academic Standards for Reading and Writing to recognize and integrate focus standard clusters into prompts.